The auditorium smelled of fresh paint and nervous energy. Morgan Freeman slipped through the side door of Jefferson High School's theater just as the house lights dimmed, finding an empty seat in the back row where he could watch without being noticed. Around him, families settled into their chairs with the kind of anticipatory excitement that only came with small-town productions where everyone knew someone in the cast. It was Friday evening in October, and the drama department was presenting their fall production of Our Town. Morgan was here at the invitation of his old friend Robert Mitchell, whose granddaughter Emma was playing Emily Webb in what would be her first leading role in high school theater. Morgan had known Robert for 30 years, ever since they'd worked together on a small film that nobody remembered and both men were proud of for reasons that had nothing to do with its commercial success. Robert had retired to this town in Western Virginia 5 years ago, trading his decades as a cinematographer for a quieter life where his biggest worry was whether his tomatoes would ripen before the first frost. "You've got to see Emma perform," Robert had said during their phone call last month. "She's got something special. Reminds me of actors I worked with in the early days before they learned to be careful. Raw, honest, completely fearless." Morgan had driven down from his home in Mississippi, partly to see his friend, but mostly because he'd learned over the years that the best performances often happened in places where stakes felt personal rather than professional. High school auditoriums, community theaters, small venues where actors performed for people who knew their real names and would remember their faces at the grocery store for years afterward. The Jefferson High Auditorium held maybe 200 people, and tonight it was nearly full. Parents with cameras, siblings who'd been dragged along, grandparents who wouldn't miss this for anything, and a scattering of community members who supported local theater because they understood that art mattered even when it happened in a converted gymnasium with lights that had been installed by volunteers. Morgan recognized the energy immediately. Different from professional theater, where audiences came as strangers and left as strangers. This crowd was invested in ways that had nothing to do with reviews or awards. They were here to watch their children and grandchildren and neighbors attempt something brave, the simple act of pretending to be someone else in service of a story that might help everyone understand something about being human. The play began simply, with the stage manager walking out to address the audience directly about life in the fictional town of Grover's Corners. The actor was a senior named Jake Morrison, tall and lanky with the kind of natural confidence that suggested he'd been performing since childhood. His delivery was clear and unaffected, drawing the audience into Thornton Wilder's meditation on ordinary life and the passage of time. Morgan watched from his corner seat as the familiar story unfolded. The Webb and Gibbs families going about their daily routines, young George and Emily discovering first love. The simple interactions that Wilder had written to show how extraordinary ordinary moments could be when viewed with the right perspective. Emma Mitchell was everything her grandfather had promised. 19 years old, with dark hair and an expressive face that could shift from joy to concern to love without ever looking calculated. She inhabited Emily Webb with the kind of natural honesty that couldn't be taught, only encouraged. When she spoke to her mother about the beauty of life, when she flirted with George Gibbs, when she marveled at the simple fact of being alive, every word felt discovered rather than recited. The first 2 acts proceeded smoothly, the high school cast navigating Wilder's deceptively simple dialogue with more skill than Morgan had expected. These weren't professional actors with years of training, but they understood something essential about the play, that its power came from truth rather than technique, from recognizing real emotion rather than performing theatrical emotion. But it was during the 3rd act that everything changed. The final act of Our Town is perhaps the most challenging in American theater. Emily, who has died in childbirth, is given the opportunity to return to Earth for one day to relive her life. She chooses her 12th birthday, hoping to experience the joy of that day again. Instead, she discovers that the living are too caught up in the rush of daily life to appreciate the beauty that surrounds them. The scene requires the actor playing Emily to convey profound sadness and understanding, to show an audience the tragedy of not paying attention to life while we're living it. Emma had been building toward this moment all evening, and Morgan could see her preparing for the emotional weight the scene would require. She had the technique to deliver the lines correctly and the instinct to understand what they meant. But as she began Emily's final monologue, something happened to Jake Morrison. The stage manager in Our Town serves as narrator, guide, and philosophical center of the play. In this final scene, he helps Emily understand why her return to life has become unbearable, why the dead let go of earth not from indifference, but from a kind of merciful wisdom. It's a role that requires maturity beyond most high school actors' experience, the ability to speak about life and death with authority that feels earned rather than borrowed. Jake had been handling the responsibility well throughout the evening, but as Emma delivered her heartbreaking realization about the blindness of the living, as she spoke about how people don't appreciate life while they have it, something in Jake's composure cracked. He was supposed to respond to Emily's pain with the stage manager's gentle wisdom to help guide her back to the peace of death with words that acknowledged her suffering while placing it in the larger context of human experience. Instead, he stood silent. Not the kind of dramatic pause that actors use for effect, but the frozen silence of someone who had lost his place not just in the script, but in his own understanding of what he was supposed to be doing. Morgan could see it clearly from his seat in the back row. The moment when Jake's confidence evaporated, when the weight of trying to speak wisely about life and death overwhelmed his 19-year-old understanding of what those words actually meant. The silence stretched across the auditorium like a held breath. Emma, still in character as Emily, looked at Jake with the kind of gentle concern that suggested she was trying to help him find his way back to the scene. The other actors on stage shifted almost imperceptibly, everyone suddenly aware that something had gone wrong but uncertain how to fix it. Morgan felt his muscles tense with the instinct to help. He could stand up, walk down the aisle, step onto the stage, and quietly deliver Jake's lines, giving the boy time to recover his composure. The audience would be surprised but grateful. The scene would continue. The play would reach its proper conclusion. He had the authority to do it. Everyone in the auditorium would recognize his voice the moment he spoke. His presence would transform the evening from a high school production into something else entirely, a moment when a famous actor had saved a student production, a story that would be told in this town for decades. But as Morgan sat in the dark auditorium, watching Jake struggle with words that were too large for him to carry, he made a different choice. He stayed in his seat, not from indifference or fear of drawing attention to himself, but from a deeper understanding of what this moment required. Jake wasn't failing because he lacked talent or preparation. He was struggling because the play had asked him to speak about things that 19-year-olds, no matter how gifted, couldn't fully comprehend. The silence continued for what felt like minutes, but was probably only 30 seconds. Long enough for everyone in the auditorium to understand that this wasn't a planned pause, that something genuine and unscripted was happening. Then Jake did something that surprised everyone, including himself. Instead of trying to deliver the stage manager's written lines about life and death and the passage of time, he spoke directly to Emma as himself, as a 19-year-old boy trying to help a friend who was struggling with profound sadness. "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the small auditorium. "You don't have to carry all of that alone." The words weren't Thornton Wilder's. They weren't the stage manager's philosophical observations about the nature of existence. They were Jake's own attempt to offer comfort to someone in pain, filtered through his 19 years of experience with friendship and loss, and the simple human desire to help when someone you care about is hurting. Emma responded not as Emily Webb the character, but as Emma Mitchell the actress, who understood that her scene partner was offering her something real. "I know," she said, "but sometimes it feels too heavy anyway." What followed was the strangest and most moving conclusion to Our Town that Morgan had ever witnessed. Jake and Emma abandoned Wilder's script entirely and had a conversation as themselves, as two young people trying to make sense of a play that had forced them to confront ideas about mortality and meaning that they weren't ready to understand intellectually but could feel emotionally. They talked about being young in a world that seemed to move too fast for anyone to appreciate the moments that mattered, about watching grandparents grow old and wondering what wisdom looked like when you were still figuring out who you were. about the responsibility of trying to live fully when you couldn't always tell which moments were worth savoring. It wasn't sophisticated philosophy. It wasn't even particularly articulate, but it was honest in a way that scripted wisdom rarely managed to be. The audience watched in complete silence, recognizing that they were witnessing something unrehearsable and unrepeatable. Not a perfect performance of a classic play, but a real conversation between two young people grappling with the same questions that had driven Wilder to write Our Town in the first place. After 5 minutes that felt both eternal and instantaneous, Emma looked at Jake and said simply, "I think we should go now." Jake nodded. "I think you're right." They walked off stage together, leaving the audience in the kind of silence that comes after something significant has happened, but before anyone knows how to respond to it. Then the applause began. Not the polite appreciation that usually greeted high school productions, but the kind of sustained emotional response that acknowledged witnessing something rare. The moment when young actors stopped trying to perform wisdom they didn't possess and started sharing the uncertainty they actually carried. Morgan remained in his seat as the cast returned for curtain call, as flowers were presented and photos were taken, as the audience gradually filed out with the kind of animated conversation that followed evenings when expectations had been completely overturned. Robert found him in the lobby afterward, his face showing the complex mixture of pride and bewilderment that comes from watching your granddaughter do something you'd never seen before. "That was," Robert began, then stopped. "I don't know what that was, but it was something." "It was honest," Morgan said simply. "Emma's been worried she ruined the play. Jake's convinced he destroyed everything by forgetting his lines." Morgan looked across the lobby to where Emma and Jake were standing with their families, still in costume, still processing what had happened during those unscripted minutes. "They didn't ruin anything," he said. "They discovered something. They found out that sometimes the most important conversations happen when you stop trying to say the right thing and start trying to say the true thing." "You could have helped," Robert observed. "When Jake froze up there, you could have stepped in." Morgan nodded. "I could have, but then it would have been my rescue instead of their discovery. They needed to find their own way through it. And if they hadn't? If the whole thing had just collapsed? Then it would have collapsed honestly instead of succeeding artificially, but they didn't need rescue. They just needed permission to be 19 years old instead of trying to be 80. Later that evening, sitting with Robert on his back porch with coffee and the comfortable silence of old friendship, Morgan reflected on what he'd witnessed. Our Town was a play about recognizing the beauty in ordinary moments, about paying attention to life while you were living it, instead of only appreciating it in retrospect. Tonight, Jake and Emma had stumbled into a real-time demonstration of exactly that principle, abandoning the script to have the kind of authentic exchange that Wilder had written the play to inspire. They had been more honest about uncertainty than most actors ever managed to be about certainty. In failing to perform wisdom convincingly, they had succeeded in sharing confusion truthfully. Morgan's decision to stay in his seat hadn't been about refusing to help. It had been about recognizing the difference between rescue and discovery, between solving someone else's problem and allowing them to find their own solution. At 78, he understood something that he couldn't have comprehended at 19, that the most important lessons often came not from having the right answers, but from having the courage to admit when the questions were too large for easy answers. Jake and Emma would remember this night for the rest of their lives, not as the time they forgot their lines and ruined the school play, but as the moment they learned that authentic struggle was more valuable than performed success. And Morgan would carry it with him as a reminder that sometimes the most helpful thing you could do for young artists was to trust them enough to let them find their own way through the darkness, even when you had the power to turn on the lights. The play had ended differently than Thornton Wilder had written it, but it had ended exactly as it needed to, with two young people discovering that honesty was more important than perfection, and an audience learning that the best performances happened when actors stopped acting and started being human. In the distance, the lights of Jefferson High School's auditorium finally went dark, but the conversation that had begun on that stage would continue in the minds and hearts of everyone who had witnessed it, proof that sometimes the most memorable theater happened not when everything went according to plan, but when plans became irrelevant and truth took over.